Thanks for joining us today for a discussion on the future of land-related indicators in the 2030 Agenda. We have a wonderful lineup of experts to discuss this topic with us and to answer any questions you may have. We can also use this time to coordinate advocacy efforts more generally around measuring implementation of land-related sustainable development goals. I'm Caitlin Cordes of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, which is a joint center of Columbia Law School and the Earth Institute. The center has a keen interest in supporting secure land rights, which we believe are crucial to ensuring that international investments have positive rather than negative impacts for local communities and for stakeholders more generally. The center also serves as the host institution for the UN Sustainable Development Solution Network, for the network's Thematic Network 10 on good governance of extractive and land resources. This Thematic Network is one of 12 working under the auspices of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network and focused on sustainable development goal advocacy and implementation in key areas. For those of you unfamiliar with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, it's an initiative of the UN Secretary General comprising a network of diverse stakeholders who further the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda by providing technical guidance on SDG implementation, identifying cutting-edge innovations, and encouraging integrated solutions to sustainable development problem solving. Over the past several years, a thematic group on good governance of extractive and land resources has convened several workshops and meetings and published various pieces in this area, including efforts to ensure that land governance and land tenure were incorporated into the Sustainable Development Goals. And in February of this year, the Thematic Network on Good Governance of Extractive and Land Resources was launched as an expanded network of experts and practitioners. It now has 130 members representing 80 participating organizations and provides a platform for collaboration on issues at the nexus of sustainable development and the governance of natural resources. For further information about the network, please reach out to anyone at my center. We'd be happy to discuss it with you further. Today, the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment and the Thematic Network are delighted to partner with the Land Portal Foundation, the Global Land Tool Network, and the Global Land Indicators Initiative to co-host this webinar. We'll start with opening keynote remarks from Robert Ndugwa from the Global Urban Observatory Unit of UN Habitat, who will provide updates on the SDG land-related indicators and will help frame our discussion this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. And we will then have short presentations from our other experts, Tamsin Hudson from Habitat for Humanity and Evelyn Nierse of the Global Land Indicators Initiative. After these presentations, we'll have some brief remarks from Yulia Panfil of the Omidyar Network, and then we'll have a short overview from Laura Meggio-Laro regarding the Land Portal's new SDG dashboard. We'll then use the remainder of our time for a question and answer session with Robert, Evelyn, and Tamsin. Just two quick reminders for everyone participating today. First, this webinar is being recorded and will be publicly available afterwards. And second, webinar participants have been automatically muted. So if you wish to ask a question, you can submit it via the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. And now I'd like to turn it over to Robert. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Caitlin, for a very wonderful introduction to this very important webinar. Just to start off first, I think when we talk of the future of land-related indicators in the 2030 agenda, we just need to recall that land has been at the center and the core of all the sustainable development in the last 20 to 50 years. What I think is a big game changer is the fact that for the first time, we are getting at the global level indicators that can help us monitor the impact of land and land management and how it really impacts the whole sustainable development. And for today's webinar, I will perhaps focus a little more on one specific example. That's the indicator 1.4.2 in the Sustainable Development Goals. Slide, please. Slide. So I'll be talking about a little bit of an overview of the ongoing work on the indicator 1.4.2, but of course linking that to all the other land-related SDG indicators. And to start off this conversation, I just wanted to reflect on the bigger picture of where all these indicators and goals actually do fall. And we have in total 17 goals with about 169 targets and about 240 indicators. When you examine all these goals and targets, you'll actually notice that there's quite a number of other land-related SDG indicators that of course remain of interest to the global community that is working on land. Specifically, the indicator 1.4.2 is currently tier 3 belonging to goal number 1, which is on poverty. And this is perhaps one of the main flag bearers when it comes to monitoring land, alongside several other indicators such as the 5A.1 as well as 5A2. But we also have other indicators, for example, 11.3.1, which looks at the land consumption rate, which is mostly tied around the urban expansion transformations. So there are quite a number of other indicators, and these indicators all belong into several classes. They could be tier 1, where at the global level, the statistician think that it's a very conceptually well thought indicator, methodology is well developed, and standards are available. And tier 2s are those where it's very similar to tier 1, but the difference is just the regular collection by our countries in terms of how many countries are actually collecting that indicator. Tier 3 is where they think that, you know, it's currently an indicator that is being worked on, methodology is not yet clear, standards don't exist, and therefore no country is in position to collect that specific indicator. So indicator 1.4.2 is currently tier 3, and as a result, we are currently going through a lot of back and forth discussions with experts, with other constituencies and other global community experts, trying to refine the methodology as well as the standards and how to collect data for this indicator, but also how to build the capacity for this specific indicator. The 1.4.2, just to remind our listeners, is basically focused on the proportion of the total adult population with secure tenure rights, and those who have legally recognized documentation or who perceive their rights to land as secure. There is also a few footnotes linked to that indicator, which is specifically the disaggregation, that we should ensure that the indicator is disaggregated by sex as well as type of tenure. And of course, when you reflect on those, the indicator is tied basically around the component of the adult population, how secure their rights are when it comes to land, but also disaggregation, because quite a number of countries, the data we look at, it tends to be biased, at least in one gender or another. There's plenty of work that is going into the methodological development of this indicator. We've already organized 3 very important expert group meetings this year, together with the World Bank, who are co-custodians on this indicator with UN Habitat. And from that process, we've been able to refine aspects to do with the survey sides of how to collect this specific indicator, but also linking it to the collection processes of the other indicators on land. We've also looked at the administrative data side, which is also supporting the whole idea of using the land registrars and the cadasters that are in place to see how best to link that with population registers, and then build the tool to be able to report on the performance of this specific indicator. In terms of work that lies ahead, we do have quite a number of consultations that we've already undertaken with the national statistical organizations, who also participated in the expert group meetings. But in the next phase, we are also looking at a lot of data analysis and further consultation with these national statistical organizations and other member states to make sure that we really build the evidence that we need to take down to the interagency expert group on SDGs. And what is important in this whole process is to demonstrate that the methodology has been revised, has been updated, at the global level through teams of experts and other consultations, but also to demonstrate that this has been done with member states who have the primary responsibility for actually collecting the bulk of the SDG data that is followed. So as part of the support to this indicator, we've also undertaken an assessment of the national statistical capacities, basically to try and learn how countries are able to support the whole land monitoring going beyond just this indicator. So basically examining the preparedness in terms of the systems, but also in terms of the national level teams, but also the understanding of the indicator and its components. And part of the results we obtained from this analysis is quite mixed, but very promising in the sense that land has been monitored in one way or another from quite a number of previous surveys from the Living Standards and Measurement Surveys, or DHS, or the UNICEF-led mix. So they're already platforms that we can build on and refine with a new refined set of questions that we are going to put forth to these member states. So this process is currently ongoing. In November, we expect to have a very important meeting, which is the Interagency Expert Group meeting on SDGs. And this meeting is going to review the current progress of majority of the Tier 3 indicators, with the hope that if we make a good case on the methodological development, we could successfully request for reclassifying this indicator to Tier 2. The moment the indicators become Tier 2, you then qualify to begin reporting at the global level. And therefore, if that's successful, we hope that in the next year's UN Secretary General's report, we will be able to report for the first time how the global picture looks like on the land indicator, specifically 1.4.2. But we are pushing a lot in terms of harmonizing plus aligning with all the other SDG indicators, for which, on the positive note, some are already Tier 2, for example, 5A.1, which FAO leads, is already Tier 1. So it will give us a chance to make a connection to all the other land-related indicators. In terms of process, what we will be submitting in November is basically an update of our work plan, a detailed description of the metadata, and an update on the rationale why the indicator should be basically reclassified. And within the work plan, what we basically document there is the how the indicator will be monitored, with whom this will be monitored, and how it will be reported on, and the frequency of how this will be reported on, as well as describing the elements of data flow. So these are all well articulated at the moment, and we are very optimistic that we have a good case for reclassification. Alongside that, we've also done a lot of analysis of data, plus also working with other countries to pilot test the new questions in new modules, and this is all quite promising currently. And if all goes well, then we do hope that we will have a very detailed work plan to look at, which basically post the November meeting will give us a chance maybe to fine-tune the methodology, just patching up a few remaining areas, build the elements of collaborations with all the other teams that we've worked with, but also bringing on board new constituencies, maybe academic institutions, registrars, private sector where possible, and then also build and package our data collection protocols as well as standards, which then will be able to help us build the capacities of the national statistical systems all across the board, but also support them in the data collection, analysis, and reporting. And I think this incremental process will give us an opportunity to, of course, expand and maybe add a few variables of interest, take care of elements of disaggregation, but also ensure that we have the right coverage in terms of global reporting. But at the end of all this process, once the capacities are well built at the national level, we'll continue playing a significant role at the global level to ensure that the standards don't drop and that countries actually pick up the reporting with the acceptable statistical standards on these indicators. So perhaps to speak then to the subject of this webinar, what is the real future of land-related indicators? It's quite a very promising aspect. We're not only right now looking at the side of maybe just the population side of the indicators, but on the other land indicators, we're also exploring the aspect of the geospatial, what it really tells us in terms of who lives where and what do they live on in terms of documentation. So geospatial components or Earth observation technologies are also coming in handy to complement the population-based indicators such as 1.4.2. And so where I sit, the way I see the future of land is that this is in our hands. For the first time, we have the opportunity to monitor all this at the global level, and the standards are currently being set in a very proper and an acceptable manner. And therefore, for the next 15 years, once all this tier reclassification is completed, we should be able to monitor our global indicators on land in a way that will really ensure sustainable development is guaranteed. So with those remarks, I say thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Robert. And we look forward to coming back to you for the question and answer session as well. And now I'd like to turn it over to Tamsin for your remarks.
On land-related, oh, sorry. Am I muted? Seems I'm muted.
You're fine. You're fine right now.
Okay, good. Thanks. Okay, so I did recognize that this was on land-related indicators. However, I was asked to talk about solid ground and the urban approach. So I think what I might do is just give you some sense of our solid ground campaign, which is a global campaign, and it's really recognizing the central importance and significance of land from a sustainable development perspective. I mean, land is a really key developmental driver. And so as we look at our campaign, we've rolled it out across a number of countries. There are 30 countries now that have programs in place. And so I'm going to just speak to some of these programs just to give you a sense very quickly of what they look like. So I think, as Robert rightly said, there is certainly a shortage of information and data that is available on land documentation. And so in Zambia, for instance, we noted that security of tenure, particularly in peri-urban areas, is a major challenge for the majority of the poor, especially those in informal settlements. And so what we've gone about doing is looking at tenure as a key component to the right to adequate and affordable housing, which is obviously, I mean, a habitat is really focused on shelter solutions. And so we have a number of programs where we certainly engaging with decision makers, particularly at local government level, city council level, and with communities. And in particular, we had a very successful breakthrough recently with City Council in Ndola on the Copper Belt in Zambia. And this engagement with decision makers really led to the issuance of land record cards. And so we had a tremendous success with 3,000 people in communities were issued with these cards. I think the big challenge that we have as an organization is really to document this in a systematic way and to make this data available to central government, and so that it's captured in central government by the statistical agencies. So certainly we are doing a lot of awareness raising on land rights, which I think is also tremendously important, particularly also from a gender standpoint. Zambia, I think one of the big issues is that the land policy is yet to be approved, and so this is also a big advocacy effort that we'll be engaging upon. Very briefly, in Cote d'Ivoire, we've also have a program, a solid ground program in place. And from a land perspective, we are going to be engaging in a baseline survey on land tenure ownership in rural communities. And there's going to be actually 5 regions that we'll be focusing on, as well as doing a very big sensitization campaign. because I think obviously we recognize that along with the need to document land systematically, there's also a need to, at the same time, start building this awareness amongst communities, and also recognizing the tremendous role that they have to play. And we know that this, many of our partner agencies like SDI and others in Wairu Commission have been tremendously successful at gathering community level data. Just really to start ending off, in South Africa, Habitat South Africa has registered a tremendous success with the provincial government, to the extent that we were part of a coalition of two other organizations that developed what they call the Informal Support Settlement Plan. And so this is really, I think, a more comprehensive and all-encompassing approach. And this is really where one recognizes the importance of sound baseline data, looking at population growth projections, and as Robert mentioned, spatial planning to form the backbone of managing land settlements, and to manage the proliferation of informal settlements in an organized and planned way, with an access to ensuring access to basic services, of course, tenure issues, and and obviously from our perspective to make sure that we have these good standard housing and well-planned settlements. So I'm really going to end off there. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tamsin. And I'm sure there will be more questions for you as well during the question and answer session. And I am delighted to now ask Everlyn to share her thoughts with us.
Oh, thank you. So from what I'm going to share also aligns to what Robert has been able to present. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
Good. So next slide, please. So the Global Land Indicator Initiative is a global initiative that brings different partners, multi-stakeholders from the civil society, UN agency, multilateral research and academia together to be able to look into the aspects of land governance monitoring. For those who are familiar with the efforts to have global land indicators, this discussion went on for a number of years before the foundation of the Global Land Indicator Initiative as a global platform that champions land development of land indicators, tools, and methodologies in 2012 by World Bank and Millennium Challenge Corporation. The Global Land Tool Network here at UN Habitat jointly came together. But now this platform has grown significantly to include over 50 global partners working on land governance monitoring. Specifically to mention that this initiative aims at making land monitoring at scale possible or a reality by end of 2030. And also this links not just with the SDGs, that is the context of our discussion, but looking at global land governance in various perspectives and to promote and advance the frameworks that have been promoted, particularly the VGGTs, which actually inspired a lot of partners who came on board to establish the Global Land Indicator Initiative. We also had the AU Framework and Guidelines for Land Policy Initiative, and now the recent agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, where we have land included in it, but also other regional plans that are there, including the Africa Agenda 2063. So this platform that I coordinate from Nairobi is that it helps in mainly coordinating and convening and facilitating dialogues that brings together land and data communities who come together to think through frameworks, methodologies, and approaches that puts together comparable methodologies for collecting data using comparable indicators to ensure that data can be somehow similar in terms of information collected, for example, on tenure security from one country to another. We acknowledge that, of course, full comparability might be a challenge because of the different situation, but importantly to note that this initiative has been able to, was able to lobby and advocate together with a lot of other partners for the inclusion of the tenure security indicator that Robert presented or did a lot of presentation on what the custodians have been able to do, inclusion in the Sustainable Development Goals. Among those ones, or among that particular indicator, there are also other indicators that were promoted by a number of other land players, including FAO, including UN Women and other agencies that have also been able to put a lot of energy, including also UNCCD under Goal 15, as already have been mentioned. So this platform also developed global comparable and national applicable indicators that are used for monitoring at the country level, awareness and advocacy, and also facilitating access to technical support from within its partners, from consultants and other players who are able to provide that, but also knowledge management work that relates to different conceptualization of what Global Land Indicator Initiative entail. There are papers that Glee has also done on the visibility that informed, whether or not it's visible to be able to collect data from a comparable scale using comparable land indicators. We also have curriculum and methodologies that have been established that tested a comprehensive land modules in 3 countries in Africa. All these papers are available online for those who would wish to be able to check them out at the Global Land Indicator Initiative website. Next page, please. Next page. Hello. Yeah, so for those of us probably who are still grappling to understand where exactly, we go back to the third slide, sorry. We're grappling to understand what indicators have been included in the SDG when you're speaking about land. There are quite a number of these indicators that are captured in the SDGs. Kindly go back to, I'm on slide number 3. On the indicators. So I know colleagues who are participants who are joining this webinar will have a chance to be able to review and understand probably what exactly are these SDG goals. 5 of them that include land indicators. The specific targets are also covered significantly under that. Yes, that is the page. Covered under this particular slide, including the different indicators under what areas or components of land-related governance they are addressing. The next page, please. So the next page talks about the Glee achievement, just for purposes of making it brief. Glee has also worked closely with the various custodian agencies for the land indicators, mainly with the UN Habitat and World Bank for 10-year security indicator 1.4.2, but also for 5A1. It's not 5A2, but 5A1. Sorry for the first bullet. In terms of coordination and harmonization efforts that brings the 2 indicators together. Remember, 1.4.2 speaks about 10-year security in terms of it's being a universal indicator applied in both rural and urban area. But 5A1 speaks about women access to land rights, agricultural land rights. So these 2 indicators were found to be very similar, and important that harmonization aspects were looked into in terms of definition, in terms of concepts, and more importantly, also a resultant effort has led to establishment of a joint tool or questionnaire that will be able to produce data for these 2 indicators applied through surveys. And I think that's one of the major progressive contribution with support of the LSMS team from World Bank. Also, the Glee, the Global Indicator Initiative has also supported in hosting an EGM on securing women land rights in the SDGs with a number of players and partners, which I would want to recognize their effort also in contributing to this area of securing women land rights, not just in the SDGs, but also in an array of other areas that they are working on. The multi-country capacity assessment that Robert talked about also is an initiative that has been supported by the Global Land Indicator Initiative. There was a side event at the high-level political forum in terms of mobilizing governments and countries to appreciate why it is very important to be able to secure tenure rights and prioritize its monitoring at the country level, both from their own economic progress and making it possible to be able to account for change, but also securing tenure rights for all and making it an inclusive process. Then in addition to that, we've done also supported the preparation for reclassification, as Robert has talked about, providing both also technical support in the drafting of the materials, bringing in some technical support from the members of the Global Land Indicator Initiative, GLTN land portal page on the land and SDGs. I know probably Yulia and Laura will talk about more, so I don't have to venture into that. But also we've sustained a global discourse on land governance monitoring, one from making sure that we don't just probably take one component of this land indicator in the SDGs, but create an integrated narrative that link goal number 1 to goal number 2 on food security, tenure to food security, tenure to agricultural land for women, tenure to legal framework that advance women land rights to urban development and urban resilience in informality and so forth under Goal 11, but also sustainable land use and peace and security under number 15 and 16. Next slide. In the previous slide, you see the mention of Global Land Indicator Initiative developing 15 indicators. Most of those indicators are already provided for in the SDGs, but some are still not well adequately covered, and still methodologies will be worked out by the global indicator partners to be able to further develop them and respond to other frameworks like the VGGTs and see how best they contribute to that. From where Global Land Indicator sits and the future of land indicators, we say that evidence-based land governance is central to policy decision and programming when it comes to land-related issues. Therefore, comparable land indicators for comparable data at country level is a must, and that land indicators in the SDGs are also important and progressive, the ones that have been provided for, because one, they go beyond just ownership to embrace the continuum of land rights. For those who are familiar with the approach on continuum of land rights, they're also anchored on human rights and advance the principles that are enshrined in the VGGT's African Union Framework and Guidelines, and recently also promoted by the New Urban Agenda. From Glee, we embrace what we call comprehensive view of land governance monitoring in form of evidence data evidence for policy making, for programming, and so forth. But the areas or comprehensive areas of land governance, including land tenure security, land administration, land and conflict, as well as sustainable land use management. In terms of institutional capacity strengthening and coordinated mechanism, which also resonate with what Robert presented, is critical. The role of civil society organization and other actors also have to be enhanced and promoted to ensure that we coordinate and we are able to, challenge mechanism put in place by governments to ensure that they produce better data, quality data, gender disaggregated data. Then also from a future point of view and looking at where we are, we're saying that local actions are also critical, but the local action has to come in terms of the different initiatives that are there to influence changes in land governance processes and policies. And this means that we are monitoring and using data to paint the real picture and show where the gaps are and profile what exactly those issues are. But we need the local action to ensure that we are able to fix those problems, be it in terms of policies, in terms of inclusion, in terms of gender disaggregation or gender rights of women, indigenous people. We need different intervention that then matches and help us account for that change. So monitoring is not complete if local action is not there. The last part of it. I think I will end it there. So I want to thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Evelyn. And we will now turn it over to Julia to talk about Friends of the Custodians and other initiatives supported by the Omidyar Network and other donors.
Wonderful, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this webinar. I'll keep my remarks brief so that we can get to the Q&A portion of the webinar. My name is Julia Panfil. I am a part of the Property Rights Investments team at Omidyar Network. Omidyar Network is a private donor and impact investor working among other areas in the area of land and property rights. We're based in Silicon Valley, but have offices in Washington, DC, the UK, India, South Africa, and Singapore. I'm also part of a group newly constituted in April called Friends of the Custodians, which I'll tell you about in a moment. This was a group created as part of the global push for ensuring that land indicators are incorporated into the SDGs. So I'm here to speak briefly about the Friends group and also give you a very brief overview of some of Omidyar's efforts in the SDG land space. So as you've seen from Robert, Tamsin, and Evelyn's presentations, this has really been a broad team effort around making sure that indicator 1.4.2 moves up from tier 3 and is included as part of the SDG indicators. And the donor community has historically been quite active in pushing for the inclusion of 1.4.2 through policy papers and advocacy with the SDG Interagency Expert Group and others. So the Friends of the Custodians group really came about in March of 2017, when on the sidelines of the World Bank Land and Poverty Conference, it became apparent that while work on SDG 1.4.2 was proceeding, there was a lot to do. Time was short prior to the reclassification meeting that Robert mentioned that's happening in November, and that donors, NGOs, and others really wanted to find the best way to pitch in and help the two custodians of 1.4.2, UN Habitat and World Bank, make sure that the indicator could be successfully reclassified. So this Friends of the Custodians group was formed in April 2017, and it's comprised of 6 members. 3 are members of the Global Donor Working Group on Land. So those are donor members from the UK, from Canada, and from the US through the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And then the other 3 members are comprised of nonprofit organizations and private sector stakeholders. So one of those members is the Omidyar Network. We also have the Global Land Indicator Initiative through Everlyn and the International Land Coalition. And the objective of this group is really to support the custodians towards the reclassification of 1.4.2 to Tier 2 by this November, and then Tier 1 thereafter. Next slide, please. So just a very brief recap of, and I won't read through the slide, you can take a look at it, of the envisioned activities of the Friends of the Custodians group and what we've done to date. So as you can see, we envision our activities as helping to prepare for the expert group meetings, facilitating where we can consultation with the member states and regional and national statistical agencies, as well as advocacy, which can include events like this webinar for 1.4.2, raising awareness about why this indicator is important and why it needs to be reclassified, and also supporting coherence with other indicators like 5A1. So to date, we've been really liaising closely between the custodians and other groups, including the Global Donor Working Group on Land. We've helped coordinate the provision of evidence of regional pilots of the questions that are going to be included in Indicator 1.4.2. We've assisted in promoting and raising awareness for this indicator, and we've participated in expert group meetings and other meetings to harmonize between various indicators. And we plan to continue our work leading up to the Bahrain meeting and beyond. And really our objective is to be as helpful as possible to the custodians and others to make sure that this much needed land indicator is secure. Next slide, please. So as a final slide, I wanted to very briefly introduce the group to a few of the efforts that Omidyar Network has been making to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goal land conversation. And really our efforts have centered around transparency and around data. On transparency, we've been supporting the land portal to develop the land SDG section of their website in coordination with the Global Land Tools Network and Glee. And Laura will take you through that section in a moment, so I won't dwell on it too much, but really this portal is meant to be a one-stop shop to provide an easy-to-use snapshot of where each land indicator sits, who's responsible for it, what data is being collected, etc. The other large project that we're supporting along with DFID is something called the Global Property Rights Index, or PRINDEX, and you can take a look at it on prindex.net. And this is really the first effort to measure on a global basis how secure people feel about their land and property rights. As we know, because land records are so poor in many of the countries we work, just looking at the land registry doesn't give you an accurate picture of how secure people really feel. And this is also one of the reasons why Indicator 1.4.2 has this perception component. So Prindex uses Gallup World Poll methodology as well as other methods and is working with national statistics offices to collect perception data on property rights on a global scale. This effort is important because half of 1.4.2 is actually concerned with perception. It's measuring the proportion of the adult population that feels their rights are secure. Prindex has been recently updated to include the household survey questions that were identified in the second expert group meeting. So we see Prindex as a potential data source along with several others to complement and supplement the independent efforts of the national statistics agencies and to feed into the perception portion of 1.4.2. And we're supporting this effort because we believe that a robust number of different data sources and options will help ensure the reclassification of this indicator and help ensure that data is collected robustly enough for it to move into Tier 1, which is really the ultimate goal. So with these remarks, I would like to thank you and turn it back over to Caitlin.
Great, thank you very much, Yulia. And Laura, it's over to you now to talk about the Land Portal's new SDG dashboard.
Hi, good afternoon to everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, thank you.
Okay, great. So, welcome everybody. My name is Laura Meggiolaro, and I'm the coordinator of the Land Portal. For those that are not familiar with, the Land Portal Foundation is working for a world of improved land governance and creating and maintaining a leading online destination for information, data, and knowledge exchange on land governance issues. I want to thank SDSN and GLTN to co-organize this webinar with the Land Portal Foundation, and also thank you to all the experts that have presented so far. It was related, they shed a light to these SDGs and the implication for land and the land community. So I'm here today to present a section that the Land Portal has recently launched in collaboration with GLTN and Glee to make information related to land indicators in the SDGs widely available. As Yulia said, this work was supported by Omidyar network. So we believe that this section addresses an important information gap and will help the land community, practitioners and policymakers, but the community as a whole, to keep track of progress towards achieving land-related SDGs. There are numerous indicators that interagency expert group on the SDGs have indicated as relevant for land, and the land community, different actors are advocating for supporting in different capacities. So for this reason, the dashboard, I'm showing my screen. I want to walk you through this section. The dashboard, this is the landing page that shows at a glance all the SDG land-related goals and targets and indicators. So the sections covers indicators 1.4.2, which is everybody knows about, on land tenure security, including perception of land rights, but also 2.3.1 and 0.2 on smallholder farmers, and what they earn and how much they produce, and also 2.4.1 on proportion of agriculture area under productive and sustainable agriculture. Then we have the 5A 1 and 2 on ownership and share of land rights of women and legal frameworks for women land rights. We have 11.1.1 and 11.3.1 and 11.7.1 relating to sustainable urban tenure and open spaces as Tenzin described. And finally, 15.1.1, 1.2, and 3.1 related to forest areas and biodiversity in degraded lands. So the dashboard provides a snapshot of all these indicators, and then you can jump to individual indicators page. This is an example where the description of the indicators is provided, and also we try to respond to the main question as what is the method for measuring these indicators and why is that important, and who is working on monitoring these indicators. Details on each indicator, such as the tier status, key dates and important events related to the indicators, as well as who are the custodian agencies, in this case, the UN Habitat, World Bank, and partner organizations are relevant for the indicator are. And we are also pulling existing, as Robert said, there are existing tools and data being collected by many agencies related to each indicator. So the land portal has been ingesting data, statistical numerical data over the last 3 years. So we pulled here and made some visualizations just to show which data are related to each indicators. For instance, here for the 1.4.2, we pulled data from Prindex and also Landmark and other data from the World Bank. Finally, for each indicator, we collect news and blogs and library resources related to each specific indicators. As I said before, the page is meant to provide a snapshot as a one-stop shop for all the indicators. So for all the indicators here, it becomes immediately visible what a tier status is, and also there is a timeline where the most important events for the land and SDG community. So for instance, there is next event on October the 2nd, the deadline for submission of reclassification request, and then the Bahrain meeting in November. In collaboration with SDSN and GLTN, we also launched blog series to keep to maintain a high level of awareness and attention towards the land and the SDGs. So every week, in consultation with our partners, we post different blogs from experts from the land community to make different voices heard. And yeah, so this is what the section on the land portal is offering. Of course, the page also has links to relevant platform websites, and then advocacy efforts that are visible on Twitter. So basically, this is our efforts. So we hope that this dashboard, as well as the series of webinars we are co-organizing, the blogs and all the advocacy efforts, contribute towards the reclassification of the land-related indicators, and more in general to, consider land and tenure security as key components of sustainable development. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Laura. It's now time to open up the discussion for our question and answer session. As a reminder, if you have any questions for our experts, please type it into the questions box on the right-hand side of the screen. We've already received some wonderful questions and are looking forward to seeing even more as we continue this discussion. I will start with a question that was posed to the entire group, but I'll ask Everlyn to answer it first. And it's a question about whether a partnership program exists to harmonize good practices around tenure security, and whether you have case studies you can share on successful actions. Everlyn, do you have any thoughts on that? And if Everlyn is having trouble connecting right now, Robert or...
Sorry, just give me a minute, please.
Perfect.
A minute, please.
Okay, great. So Everlyn will join us in a minute. Robert or Tamsin, do you have an answer that you'd like to share? Okay, let me move on to another question.
I can take the question now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Could you kindly post the question again?
Yes, so the question is, does a partnership program exist to harmonize good practices around tenure security?
Yeah, thank you. To the person who has asked the question whom I'm not able to identify. Yes, a partnership initiative exists, and this initiative is the Global Land Indicator Initiative, which, as I indicated earlier, brings over 50 partners to develop the global land indicators. They came up with 15 set of indicators even before the SDGs came on board. They've also worked on a number of other initiatives, including a curriculum, the land tools, and so forth, and still sustain the contribution and support to the custodian agencies working on the different land indicators. So this is the initiative so far at the global level, and lots of partners at the national level, at the regional level, are party to this initiative. And so far, that is what has been, I can say it is the initiative at the moment. And working closely with other initiatives, for example, the ILC supporting also the civil society to come up with more people-centered development indicators on land, and also finding ways that people-centered data that has been developed through community and civil society processes can also be able to contribute to the formal data collection systems, particularly the national statistical agencies. So that is also a data initiative and a partnership that we can also say that exists and is complementary to the work of the Global Land Indicator Initiative. Maybe I can stop there.
Wonderful, thank you. And there was a sub part of that question too, which was, do you have any case studies that you could share on successful actions? It sounds like you've been doing a lot of work, so I guess the question might be whether there are case studies that have been documented in some way that could be shared, or that Glee has already shared.
Yes, we have done the pilots in 3 countries in Africa. The report will be soon available online in Cameroon, Nigeria, and Kenya. That helped us in the development of the comprehensive land tool module, particularly on a tenure security perspective. In addition to that, we have different working papers. One looked at the conceptual framework for developing land indicators. We have a paper that looks at the different scenarios for application of the land indicators in terms of how practically is applied at the country level. We also have a paper that developed the curriculum for application and for learners who would want to learn how to conduct data collection at the country level. And all this, particularly the pilots, went ahead also in collaboration with national statistical agencies. So we were able to test the visibility. What we were not able to sufficiently do is to test, that like to collect data and really relay data from those countries, although the collection procedure or the testing did give some form of data. As you are aware, the Land Initiative, the Land Indicators Initiative just started recently in 2012. It has received a major boost with the inclusion of land indicators in the SDGs, and therefore the process is still ongoing. And that's why we find the opportunity of securing the land indicators in the SDGs as a major step forward to have countries mainstream data collection for land-related land governance issues, including the tenure security component. So we do not have data per se that Glee has collected, but various partners, including the World Bank, already have data. Some of this data respond to the data that we are talking about, trying to make it as comparable as possible. The methodology that is being developed for 1.4.2 and the other land indicators in the SDGs must be robust. And the reason why they're either classified as tier 3 or tier 2 or tier 1 is because of some of those considerations. So we are really upbeat and ready, working with the custodian agencies who have also been giving a lot of technical support to be able to champion this process. Hopefully very soon, and maybe looking at 2018, we'll start seeing countries, getting data in for 1.4.2, 5A1, and the rest of the indicators in the SDG framework.
Wonderful. Thank you, Evelyn. Robert or Tamsin, did you want to add anything?
So I'm not sure that Robert is able to connect, if I could just say that, because of the connection challenge, he seems to have dropped off. So maybe I'll probably try to help as much as possible with responding to questions that might touch on the role of the custodians and the ISDG processes.
Okay, thank you so much, Evelyn. So I have another question that came in that is somewhat related to what you were discussing just right now, which is how do we translate global indicators into national indicators that can be tested and validated at the national level? Evelyn, to take the question, yes, thank you.
So in the confines of the SDGs, it's important to understand that the data collection and reporting mechanism stops with the national statistical agencies. But in the context of land, the land agencies are equally very important, and we cannot just work with the national statistical agencies without the land agencies. Then how do we move these global indicators that are supposed to measure and track progress on the different targets in the SDGs at the national level? So first of all, the custodian agencies have a responsibility to support the development of the land indicators in terms of methodology for how that indicator will be measured. And this means developing the questions, developing the formula for calculating that methodology, and they cannot just do it by themselves. They have to, in this case, involve the national statistical agencies, including those probably having membership at the interagency expert group on SDGs. They have to work closely with the land agencies who have cadastre and land registry records for land. Very important, the civil society and other stakeholders. So the custodian agencies in this case have tried their best to work with all these agencies and more closely with the national statistical agencies and the land agencies to be able to develop the methodology. So the national statistical agencies and the national land agencies have to agree that this methodology that has been proposed is robust together with the other stakeholders. And in this case, for example, for custodians for 1.4.2, as well as the already 5A1 is a tier 2 indicator, means already they have a well-established, robust methodology. For other indicators also they are at different levels of the tier system. So once this has been subjected to the process of developing, having the robust methodology, submission to the interagency expert group, particularly for tier 3 indicator for which 1.4.2 falls, it means therefore, what if this indicator is accepted and reclassified from tier 3 to tier 2? It means the methodology has been accepted. And therefore, custodian agencies working with other agencies can proceed and start building and strengthening the capacity of the national statistical agencies together with the land agencies and other actors working together with them at the country level. That is only when now data can start, capacity can be strengthened, mainstreaming of those questions in national surveys, in international surveys that are done at the country level, therefore making it also highly comparable, because how questions are already designed and how they're going to be executed. There's already a methodology that guides how that data is going to be collected. Of course, there'll be country contextualization and customization of those questions, but still a lot of, the robustness in terms of comparability will still be secure to a greater extent. So that is how data will be collected at the national level. So the indicator process development at the global level still mirror and ensure that there's consultation with the national level, where data will be collected, where analysis will be done, where reporting will be done from the national statistical agencies to the custodians, from the custodians to the to the UN Statistical Division. That is the procedure. I hope I've been able to respond to that.
Yes, indeed. And I think, thank you very much for the question. From as Evelyn correctly says, from a civil society perspective, there is a tremendous obligation to actually raise awareness about the processes and the standardized methodologies. Because I think for me, the big challenge is at the community level and local government levels, where that's where a huge amount of information needs to be collected. And these tracking mechanisms and also getting the communities empowered, because very often this is where the information sits, is communities are tremendously, are the knowledge bearers. And so I think for us as an organization, the challenge is really how to systematize the collection of information at the local government and community levels, and then find the ways to systematize it at a national level and how to collect it. And I think one of the big challenges that has been noted is around community-driven data, which is able to be validated, but I think it's just how to then incorporate it into the National Statistical Agency processes. And so I think these are things that need to be clarified. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Oh, I see there's a question here. Sorry, can everyone hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, sorry, I see there is a question here for me. Is that, am I in the next line up here on 1.71?
Sure.
Okay, so certainly we definitely have recognized certainly the importance of public spaces and urban development. Public spaces have a huge role to play, not only in terms of economic growth and development and well-being. So I think certainly in terms of improving the quality of life of informal settlement dwellers, of city dwellers, there's no question that public spaces are very, very important. And of course, I know UN Habitat has a whole program around public spaces. We haven't done really sufficient work on this, but I think the program, as I mentioned earlier in South Africa, was probably the one that was most closely aligned to this. And so we really do recognize the importance of developing human settlement processes that really mobilize the community and that follow participatory and people-centered approaches, and that use a whole spectrum of approaches to collecting data, so that settlements can be planned and certainly to address planned and better settlements for living standards. And I think the Cities Prosperity Index is also a very, very useful tool that we sometimes neglect, but I think that also takes a more holistic perspective on prosperity.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tamsin. And I'll just mention, because I just realized that that question wasn't made publicly available. So the question that Tamsin was answering was about reclassifying 1.7.1 to Tier 2 to help with secure urban tenure, and whether Habitat for Humanity has a perspective on the role of public spaces in urban development. Tamsin, we did receive another question that is somewhat related to what you just mentioned, and the question is about classified areas and forests around some urban cities and towns, which are deteriorating in part because of climate change, and where these areas are also gradually or entirely occupied by communities that value them for agriculture or housing. And so the question was, from the perspective of the indicators measurement, should we list those areas as human settlements or wait for the end of occupations legalizing process to consider them in the indicators counting process, or something else?
That's quite a technical one.
Yes.
So, you know, we certainly work across rural and urban sectors, and so we actually haven't addressed forest areas in particular, but certainly as I do think that they are tremendously important from an Indigenous land tenure perspective and from an Indigenous communities perspective, and of course they are very central for these particular communities in terms of from the medicinal value, from certainly from livelihoods perspectives. And so I think that while at this point we would not recognize necessarily forests as from a human settlements perspective, I certainly think that there is room to broaden our thought processes around settlements, because obviously where humans live and seek their livelihoods, that obviously is a very broad perspective, but perhaps there is a need to be more all-encompassing on this one. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I have some questions that came in about the content of some of these indicators and what specifically they cover or not. One question was, or a comment in question was, that it's important to think about both subjective and objective tenure security indicators, including with respect to gender perspectives as well. And can the panel comment on this issue, on gender, and then both the subjective and objective ways of measuring tenure security, and maybe elaborate a bit on how indicators are trying to address both sides of this? And maybe I'll ask Evelyn first, and then after Evelyn, Tamsin.
Okay. So in my presentation, I noted earlier, okay, let's start first from the provision of the indicator. For example, tenure security 1.4.2, provide for disaggregation of that indicator by looking at the type of tenure as well as by sex. Means that we are able to disaggregate it, whether it's male or female owned, or enjoy that secure tenure of right. So the indicator also has two important components. One is the legal recognition by documentation that either makes it, gives ownership of a specific right to a piece of land or a tenure security. The second part is very important also, is the perception of tenure security. That means it's the subjective part of what we would be trying to measure. Subjective in the sense that it doesn't matter whether you have a legal documentation of your tenure, the tenure right that you enjoy, whether it's by legally documented or not, or it's just customarily owned. Someone might feel secure by virtue of either a mechanism that is available that secure gives them, security or protection, either in virtue of being in an organized community or of people living in an informal settlement, or living, for example, in a forested area, or therefore maybe a territorial rights as defined by these particular communities. So this indicator is very powerful because it takes us outside the box, where for a long time, and we've seen data that is available in most of our countries, mainly administrative data that is collected by land registries in terms of, titles and so forth, or cadastre system that therefore puts different pieces of land that are well documented at the national level. So this indicator, the dimension that is brought in through the perception component, is to be able to tease out from, for example, women land rights perspective, the extent to which a woman feels secure. And it mark you that this indicator also is a population-based indicator, meaning that it's not just getting to the household and maybe asking the household head. And in most, patriarchal society and most communities, you'll find a man being the head of the household, and therefore limiting opportunities that you'll get to learn what exactly, if you are to pick by, sampling one person from the household, the man will be the only one giving information of how he feels secure or feels his tenure is secure, whether it's under lease system, whether he's owning by title and so forth, and the voices of the women or the female member of this household will be diminishing. So this indicator, as I said, looks at the proportion of adult population for which tenure security is either secure through a person feels secure by legal documentation or perception. So the design of the questions that we've put forward presents an opportunity through the surveys, national surveys, and in this case, household survey, where also the proposal that the custodians are also finalizing in terms of the selection criteria of a member of the household that is randomly sampled and not necessarily relying on the usual traditional ways of doing household survey to only go by the household head, which in this case is likely to be a male member of that household, to be able to bring on board or increase the chances of even getting, selecting a female respondent from a household to be able to indicate how they feel as a person, as an adult member of that household, and not necessarily to say, now it's only male and therefore we cannot collect information. So in this case, it increases the chances of us bringing on board and teasing out gender dynamics, both in terms of relationship of this female or this woman in this household to the husband, in terms of spouses relationship, the woman, for example, with the bigger family members, or in terms of even any external threats that could be, threatening the security of tenure for this member from a gender perspective. So those are some of the dynamics that this indicator we find very progressive in terms of how it has been structured, and the opportunity it presents that is very different from what we've handled before. And I think this is also an area that, for example, the land and the global land. The Global Land Tool Network has advanced in terms of the continuum of land rights that looks at perception, and how communities enjoy their rights beyond just having that legal recognition, looking at the continuum approach to tenure in different communities. So maybe I will end it there, and hopefully Tamzin can add some more information.
Evelyn, I think you were extremely comprehensive. I think the only point I want to make is it's absolutely clear that there are subjective and objective measures to land tenure, and so one thing that also needs to just maybe as a footnote just be mentioned is, even in the case where communities or people have tenure security, that still can actually be taken away through land grabs, evictions, and I think there have been cases of this. So I think we also need to ensure that there's political will, and that national political leaders are also on board to really support tenure security efforts. So that's really just a footnote that I wanted to mention. But certainly we note that in many of our communities where we are working, largely I think there has been more subjective measures, and I think our challenge now is to actually balance and make sure that there are also objective standards measured. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I have another question related to the substance and content of indicator 1.4.2, and that's whether the indicator includes community-based tenure rights, and if one of you could elaborate on that. Evelyn, would you like to start with that?
Yes, the indicator is a universal indicator. Is disaggregated by type of tenure, as well as the gender perspective, or by sex. So maybe it would be important to refresh on how this indicator reads, probably for purposes of those who are listening and maybe do not have the indicator in front of them. It says the proportion of total adult population with secure tenure rights to land with legally recognized documentation and who perceive their rights to land as secure by sex and type of tenure. So the type of tenure part gives us an opportunity to disaggregate the data that we have collected into either being in an urban area or in a rural context, being in an indigenous territorial rights, for example, or community tenure security or tenure, defined by a customary type, and other forms of classification that we can put under tenure that is recognized. So in urban areas also there'll be different tenure types that are likely to fall under that comes with either property or land specific. So this indicator is a very powerful one because it helps us disaggregate the different information and seeing, for example, how secure, for example, communities living in territorial jurisdiction of tenure are feeling secure or threatened by, for example, external factors that can come with either government concessions or land grabbing or whatever forms of threats that they could attribute to that. So we have opportunity to do that. We also have opportunity within the same jurisdiction or legal tenure regime that is being looked into, that has been collected, to further disaggregate the situations of how women versus men feel in the same communities living within that specific tenure type. So I hope probably that will have responded a little.
Yes, great, thank you. Tamsin, was there anything you wanted to add?
No, I think I'll leave it there. There's obviously, definitions of communal possession of rights, but I think absolutely that the indicator clearly sets out tenure types as long as they are part of that continuum that Evelyn was talking about, and that they're recognized within the land legislation. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we also have a few questions related to the roles that specific types of stakeholders can play. And the first one is, how can Indigenous peoples and local communities meaningfully participate and contribute to developing land indicators at the national level? Evelyn, would you like to start with that? Or yeah.
Yeah, so for the indigenous communities and what their role would be in developing land indicators at the community level, one is that we need to acknowledge that already there's some form of organizing within various communities on how they govern their land, either within formal parameters or informal system of land governance. I think we have to start it from there. And they have always known, for example, where the boundaries are, how that information is kept and passed from one generation to another. When you're looking at monitoring in this context of where the global land indicators are, and maybe in the SDGs, and how national systems of monitoring also trickle down, is that the information that will be collected at the national level, we have different, the civil society working directly, for example, with these communities. We have, for example, communities that have been involved in documenting their informal or community land using other technologies. I know, for example, the social tenure domain model that is also implemented and using of other technologies has enabled communities to document their land. But to get that information also in the formal data system, it requires national consultation. And one is to ask such communities through their form of organizing, or how well they have organized to keep on pushing on to access policy spaces for land governance at the local community, at the sub-national level, as well as at the national level. Remember that apart from the discussion on land, there are also other SDG goals and targets and indicators that are being implemented in each of our countries. And there are national institutions that have been put in place to engage on SDGs and maybe support the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, including the land indicators and how those will be used to monitor targets, for example, 1.4. On access to resources. So it's important that there's linkages between the communities and what happens at their local level, to the sub-national level, to the international level. So opportunities for them, for example, to be represented in different meetings. We have, for example, the agencies like the International Land Coalition, ILC, which also have membership of the indigenous communities or people living under territorial rights represented within that platform. Those become the voices of ensuring that they have representation, not just at the national level, but also at the global level. And I know indigenous people have also had opportunity to participate in national meetings, regional as well as global, and they have mechanism through the international framework for indigenous people to also voice and put their voices forward. So one is to echo and emphasize on the importance of local organizing, multi-stakeholders engagement at the country level, where those voices can be heard, and those ones have been channeled through various representation. For example, in our expert group meeting for development of indicator 1.4.2, at the national levels through civil society that have participated directly. We've had, for example, the expert group meeting on securing women land rights in the SDGs. We had a representation from the grassroots who brought their voices to the table to ask them, how best do you want us to secure women land rights? What are the key issues? Do you feel the indicators and maybe the proposed methodology best express the interest of what you're working on? So I think looking at those is a pretty dynamic way, but I think also communities have done their best, but they can do more in terms of putting their voices and accessing policy spaces to influence the changes they want to see and get their rights recognized locally as well as internationally.
Certainly.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, Tamsin, yes, go ahead.
I'm very going to be really brief, but I think in terms of accessing policy spaces, what we have found is it's really through that data collection that once communities start becoming far more aware of their settlements in terms of doing asset mapping, demographics, and a whole host of those kinds of data collection methodologies, that is when they become very relevant for policymakers. And that is when, of course, policies can be influenced. And of course, communities also have a very important role to play in monitoring of policies. So, of course, we're looking particularly at the indicators, but communities really have a role to play in data collection and of course, in raising their concerns with policymakers.
Great, thank you. And a somewhat similar question, but a different set of stakeholders was asked about whether the private sector can be involved in the collection of data around land indicators. And someone gave the example of whether, for example, the data could be collected during the permitting processes for mining investments or for other large-scale projects. Do either of you have thoughts on that?
If anybody else would want to respond, if not, I can.
Please go ahead.
Evelyn, go ahead.
Okay, so there are different agencies can play different roles in the monitoring agenda for land and natural resources. Yes, the private sector has a role. One, as a consumer, it's actually one of the good consumer of land data. That one we cannot argue about. And they will use land data and information that is available to guide their investment and use it to inform decisions and so forth. But also we are aware that private entities can also support countries, for example, through national processes of national statistical agencies or using national surveys in terms of giving them resources or capacity strengthening to collect that data and information. Remember, if it's in the context of the SDGs, we have to work and collect data that then addresses the specific components of how the questions are, and using the basic minimum questions to respond to those data needs. In general, and maybe using different information that is collected by a private sector, for example, mining, there are also other indicators that can be able to benefit in the SDG framework. So it's not just limited to land. So such data, if it's it's collected and is in a participatory way, which I would highly emphasize, that brings together and seek to empower national agencies to be able to also do data collection and maybe better data collection, I think is highly welcome, and I think they have already been doing that, and they can be recognized for that effort. The only thing is that within the SDG framework, it has also to follow some structures and ensure consultation happen at different levels, at the country level as well as at the regional level, and that in terms of who then is the custodian of that data, who holds that data, who owns that data, it should not necessarily be the private sector. So the question of then who owns that data, how accessible will that data be, and does it belong to the community where that data has been collected? Will they be able to access it? So there are a lot of other questions that comes with the private institution collecting, but they certainly have a role to play in terms of institutional capacity strengthening to be able to help them collect data. They can also help in terms of convening and putting stakeholders together to reflect on key areas that also could help them in terms of making decisions and promoting and advocating for mechanism that then provides data that addresses key land governance issues, whether on tenure security, whether it's land administration related issues, or sustainable land use management, and so forth. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And we are running out of time, and we still have a lot of questions that have been asked. I'll just mention right now that if we don't get to your question before the end of the webinar, we will do our best to check which questions haven't been addressed and to get back in touch with people individually or as a group to answer some of those questions. I have a long one that would, deserves much more discussion than we'll be able to give, but I feel like I would be remiss without at least trying to flag it here and seeing if there are some quick answers. I'm going to condense it a little bit, but the question asks about how the evidence in the literature for the benefits of land titling or property rights formalization is ambiguous at best, with some prominent thinkers highlighting how formalization can reinforce existing socioeconomic divisions in society and can displace existing social networks and arrangements, etc. So, but the question then goes on and says, yet the global land community seems to be racing forward with an indicator based on formal titling. And so there's two sub-questions here. One is, do the two components of 1.4.2, the legally recognized documentation and perception, both need to hold true for a condition of tenure security to be assumed? And the second question is there any effort to gain a deeper understanding of the conditions under which formal titling or the designation of the indicator itself advances versus undermines local livelihoods, resource access, procedural justice, and other dimensions of tenure security? I know that's a big one and deserves probably much more discussion, but Evelyn, I'll start with you, and then Tamsin, if you have either of you have any thoughts on that.
Indeed, I would say that yes, it requires quite some time to respond, but maybe just to say in brief is that some of the documents that are being worked on of being finalized, including the metadata document that describes, the definitions, put forward the methodology, the justification behind the proposed methodology, and how that fits within this indicator, will be made available through the online portal by Land Portal GLTN initiative. So that will be made available just to make sure that maybe we'll be able to have a chance to read and maybe get some more context to that. Some of the Glee indicators working papers also are quite advanced in terms of how the different tenure perspective of being in the legal ownership versus the perception have also been elaborated. So I would also encourage the person who have asked the question also to probably look at that, but also do a bit of searching on these particular aspects. I think there'll be a lot of information under that section. So different countries, particularly the developing world, have well-established cadastre systems. And I think it's also something that we're struggling with, that despite the fact that developed countries, the European countries, for example, have well-established national cadastre system, almost fully covered, does it mean that adult population in those countries enjoy maximum tenure security and they suffer no fear or any prospects for threats on their tenure security whatsoever? Maybe some will say yes, almost 100%. Others maybe there might be some fears that we have never been documented. And I think there was a recent article in the UK about housing, I think by the seaside, that are left there and bought by the tycoons and so forth. So in terms of housing and tenure issues, the extent to which communities have either suffered in terms of adequate housing, in terms of tenure security and so forth, there could be some serious issues that have not necessarily been serviced because of fully reliance on cadastre systems. This does not mean that maybe there might be serious a violation of tenure rights, or maybe communities don't feel secure, but this indicator presents an opportunity for us to unearth the soft part from a perception point of view of how these communities really feel, or these individuals really feel as far as their tenure rights are concerned. In terms of the extent to which the advanced part of the ownership by titling, for example, advances secure tenure or otherwise, I think is subject to a number of factors, including national policies, how those policies are enforced, how pro-human rights they are in terms of safeguards, for example, on investment and so forth. It doesn't mean that because they have tenure, they have titles, under their name as owners, it's fully secured for them to enjoy the rights that comes with those tenure security. On the flip side of it, in terms of those who perceive their tenure rights to be secure, we find a lot of strength, because then it gives somebody the personal feel and ability to express their fears, which also transcend just the documentation in terms of a legal recognition of that paper. Because then there are other forces that come with the application of policies and maybe judicial and legal measures at the country level that could be, for example, be reinforced by national policies or investment policies that could throw them out, being from a communal land that is shared by a number of people, or a territorial rights, or these are indigenous people that have left somewhere, or sacred places are taken away and so forth. So communities or those individuals have an opportunity to express themselves. So the design of this indicator, which is most important to note, is that for somebody to qualify as being to enjoy tenure security, we have to show there's the component of legal, if at all they have a legal recognition, or they have a documentation or legal documentation of their tenure security, and there is the perception component. So these two have to be tied. So the final bit of the methodology that will be soon, I don't want to preempt what that computation part will entail, is that these two have to give a single proportion of adult population in that country who have secure tenure rights. And that is where the difference comes. So putting those who say, okay, we are secure by legal documentation and they feel secure, but on the other hand, whether or not they have documentation, they'll still be they'll be tested by a qualitative question on whether they really feel secure, in a span of 3 years or 5 years, but a fear of any expropriation or threat by family members and other dynamics. I know maybe this question might need a bit more elaboration, but maybe I'll stop it there.
Yeah, thank you, Evelyn. I think that we could probably have another full webinar just on that question, and probably still wouldn't be able to get to all the points that we would need to. But in the interest of time, I think we should stop there. And as I mentioned before, I know that there were questions that were asked that we didn't have time to discuss, and so we will do our best to try to go through all of those and to figure out which ones we can still answer for you in some way. And then just a reminder that this webinar was recorded, and so we will be sharing the webinar and all of the slides that went along with it, so that people will be able to peruse those at your leisure as well. Thank you. I would like to take this time now to thank everybody who participated, both on the panel and speaking, and then also participated by listening and asking such great questions. We really appreciate everyone taking their time to speak about this very important session, and look forward to continuing the discussion as we continue to push forward land-related indicators and the land agenda more generally within the SDG framework. Thank you.